definitely work better with some kind of giant meat cleaver or something. Hello, welcome back to the kitchen. Today we're going to be making squash soup. So I have my butternut squash here, and I'm going to wash that. And we're also going to be using some olive oil, sea salt and black pepper, vegetable broth, some rosemary and sage. The recipe does call for fresh. These are dried, but they are dried just this year from my garden. If you're substituting dried for fresh, you just want to use a little less than what the recipe calls, because the flavor is more concentrated in the dried. Also ginger, the recipe does call for grated fresh ginger, but this was all I could find and it actually saves a lot of work. It's just grated ginger in a tube, so that's kind of fun. Alright, and finally we are also going to be using some yellow onion, and I have leftovers from the last recipe. Alright, I've decided it's going to be a lot easier to cut up this big mama if I do it directly on the counter instead of trying to do it on that glass plate. So I'm going to make sure the counter is really clean. Okay, that was definitely challenging. It did get easier once I cut the stem off though, because the stem kept getting in the way. Alright, the recipe says that we need to peel, core, and dice this. Okay, so obviously I don't really think this is gonna peel with like a carrot peeler or something. So I'm gonna do the opposite of peeling the skin off. I'm gonna scoop the meat out, and then basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to slice it, and then I'm going to use the knife to cut off the peel like you would do for a cantaloupe, sort of. I'm running a knife around because the goop just kind of doesn't like to come out. Alright, so now I'm going to slice each one lengthwise. Okay, my very first time chopping up a raw squash, I learned a couple of things. Normally I just chop the squash in half and then rub oil all over it, and then put them cut side down on a foil covered baking sheet, and I roast them in the oven. So this is my first time working with a raw squash. It's pretty difficult. I did learn that it's easier to chop them up into smaller bits before trying to get the peel off. So that's much easier. Basically, yeah, that's basically what I learned. And then it's the same kind of strategy with the curved part at the end. Oh, that's the other thing I learned to make it easier, is to cut the curved part off first once you've got your squash into quarters. Okay, and then cut these long ones into smaller quarters first, then cut those up into multiple short sections, and then take each one of those, and if it's, don't even put your fingers there at all if you can help it. then you don't have to risk your fingers. And then with the curvy section from the bottom of the squash, I just basically chopped it into sections sort of like a cantaloupe, and then chopped each one of those into short sections. And then just do it the same method. Just put the knife down on it and don't even put your hand there to separate the rind from the fruit part. While I'm at it, I'm also going to chop up the onion a while. Quick kitchen tip, it actually is really bad to cut directly on your countertop because you can damage your counter, especially depending on what type of countertop you have. However, we don't have a cutting board here at the library, and I got kind of tired of cutting on paper plates. It just seemed like such a waste. But hopefully we are going to be getting a cutting board soon. Anyways, I'm just going to do this on the counter and just be extra careful. This recipe calls for 1 whole yellow onion, chopped. This is about 3/4 of an onion, but it was a big one, so I think it'll be okay. Alright, let's also get our garlic ready ahead of time. It's calling for 3 cloves. If you don't know, the entire head of garlic, that's called 1 head or 1 bulb. And then the cloves are each individual piece like this. So 1, 2, looks like it has some bad spots. 3. Just peel off the skin like an onion. Okay, and same thing with the garlic. I'm not going to make it super fine since we're putting the whole soup through the blender anyway. Alright, we're also going to add our herbs and our ginger, so sage, rosemary, ginger, to this bowl of the garlic since we're going to be adding all 4 of those ingredients together later in the cooking process. Alright, so we need 1 tablespoon of chopped fresh sage. So since my sage is dried, that means I'm just going to do this instead of chopping it. It's easier. Okay, and then that's about a 1/2 tablespoon. And since it's dried, we don't need to use quite as much just because it's more, the flavor is more concentrated. So I'm just going to add a little bit more, and I think that'll be good. Alright, and then we need a 1/2 tablespoon of fresh rosemary. I need them dried again, so I'm just going to sort of guesstimate on this one. Alright, so I'm adding about 1/2 the amount of rosemary as I added of the sage. So we should be good to go there. And finally we need 1 teaspoon of the ginger. Isn't that fun? It's like toothpaste. Okay. That was a little more than a teaspoon. It's fine. Alright, it says heat the olive oil in a large pot over medium heat. So I am hoping that this is large enough. It's calling for 2 tablespoons of the olive oil. I normally don't measure, so we're just gonna call that good. Alright, we're gonna let that heat And then we're gonna add the onion, salt, and pepper. Let's see if it's hot enough by dropping in a little onion. Alright, it starts to sizzle a little, so it's hot enough. And now our sea salt and pepper. We're going to be sautéing this for 5 to 8 minutes. Sauté means that you keep the food moving around pretty much the whole time, which I've been doing. These are about done because the onions are sort of translucent looking and they're not hard anymore. Alright, so it's time to add our squash. But first I'm going to add a little extra oil because the pot started going a bit dry. I'm just going to stir it here to make sure that the squash gets coated with some oil. Alright, now we're going to cook the squash for 8 to 10 minutes. We only need to stir it every once in a while, not the whole time. And we'll know when it's ready, when the squash is not hard anymore. Alright, so we'll be back in 8 to 10 minutes. Alright, so I did slightly misread the recipe before. You don't have to cook it till the squash is actually not hard anymore. You just have to cook it until it starts to get a little softer, which you can see that it is. Alright, our next step is we're going to add the garlic, sage, rosemary, and ginger. And then cook while stirring for 30 seconds or 1 minute until you can smell the spices. You can see how pretty that looks. Alright, and I can smell the sage and the rosemary. Alright, so our next step is to add 3 cups of our broth. And then we're going to bring this to a boil. After that, we're going to cover it, bring our heat down, and just simmer for 20 to 30 minutes until the squash is all the way cooked. Alright, let's add our broth. Right, here's our vegetable broth. It is 32 ounces, so that is 4 cups. So we're going to add about, we're going to add about 3/4 of what's in this box. Alright, now I'm going to turn it all the way up because I want it to come to a boil. Alright, you can see this is now boiling. I'm just going to give this a little stir because during an earlier stage of the cooking, the bottom got pretty brown, so I'm just going to try to scrape some of that brownness off the bottom so that it will become part of the soup instead of just continuing to stick to the bottom and make a mess. We'll be back in 20 to 30 minutes to check on our soup after it's been simmering. Oh, and by the way, if you're not familiar with boiling versus simmering, this is boiling. It's large bubbles coming up constantly. Alright, this is more of a simmer. Small bubbles coming up occasionally. Now this pot is not the greatest example because it is going to immediately go very quickly from boiling to simmer to nothing. But on your stovetop you will just see a few bubbles popping up from time to time, and that is the simmer. Now let's see, it's totally flat. And now it's bubbling to life again. So basically, if you have a stovetop, this is going to be a lot easier. You just have to find a setting on your stove where it's going to stay at a simmer with the lid closed, or closed but open a tiny crack is how some people do a simmer. With this pot, I'm probably just going to have to stand here and keep turning this dial back and forth. in order to keep it at a simmer. Alright, you can see our squash is very squishy, so that's perfect for putting it through the blender. Alright, we have our mini blender here that we're going to be using, so we're going to have to do it in batches. The recipe does say that if you find your soup is too thick to go through the blender, you can add up to a cup more of the broth. I'm just going to go ahead and do that right now because I'm anticipating that it will be too thick otherwise, because this blender doesn't usually work that great unless whatever you're blending has a good bit of liquid in it. Also, this is going to help our soup to cool down a bit faster, since this has been in the refrigerator, and we do need to wait till it cools down a little bit before we put it through our blender. Alright, I did try some of the soup. It's really good, and as you saw from the pictures earlier, it's very beautiful with the orange color with the sunflower seeds on top. The recipe does recommend serving it with pepitas, which are those little salty pumpkin seed things. It would be really good with that too. I just couldn't find any of those, so it's also good with sunflower seeds. Alright, thanks for joining me in the kitchen today. I hope you enjoyed this recipe if you choose to make it. This recipe did come from a website called Love and Lemons. I can't remember if I mentioned that before, but I will link that below. I hope you enjoyed spending time in the kitchen today, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, bye!